All right, so it sort of depends how far back you want to go, because the significance of the word planetarium has changed over time. What you're looking at here is two patents from 1896 from the Canadian Patent Office, Canadian designs for a planetarium. That is to say, what we think of as almost like an orrery. This is the Trippensee Planetarium on the left, and on the right appears to be someone trying to copy it and get it into the patent office a few days later. You can tell that the one on the left is more complex with gearings and so on. The one on the right is something where you basically just change the position of the different bodies that are in it by hand. There doesn't appear to be a gear train in it at all. So the one on the left was found by Alexander Lang. He was from Essex County, Ontario. He later emigrated to Detroit. That's where he passed away, but he's born back in Essex, Ontario. So he simulated a planetarium, built a planetarium that could simulate the movement of the Earth around the sun, the moon around the Earth, and Venus around the sun. Even though the Venus orbit was a little bit, the rotational axis, that is, of Venus, was a little bit odd. It was not accurate by what we now understand to be true. Mr. Lang was an associate member of the Astronomical and Physical Society of Toronto between 1896 and 1899, which I hasten to add was not the RASC. It was an interesting precursor of the RASC at the time. He demonstrated his device at a meeting of the Society on May 12, 1896. And he moved to Detroit to patent to further produce it. And in 1905, he sold his company to his employee, Frank Trippensee, and the Trippensee brothers. And you can go out and get a Trippensee planetarium even today. But it's interesting to note that this device had Canadian roots. And there's a couple more photos to show it in more detail. It's kind of like an orrery. Here's an orrery that I 3D printed some time ago. You might be able to see it on the shelf behind me. I'm not sure. Where there's a gear train that accurately simulates the rates of rotation and orbit of planets. All right. A number of you will recognize Dr. Chant. This is Dr. Chant, the founder of the Dunlap Observatory in Toronto. He visited Jena in Germany in 1928. He visited first Leiden in the Netherlands for the International Astronomical Union meeting. And then he went to Heidelberg for the Astronomische Gesellschaft. And he was visiting Jena on a side trip from Heidelberg to see the Zeiss Planetarium in action and to talk to the Zeiss people about their telescopes, because by 1928, he was well involved in making plans for building the David Dunlap Observatory. So why Zeiss? Okay, well, between 1930 and 1941, when the United States entered the Second World War, 5 US cities installed public Zeiss planetariums: Chicago, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, New York, and Pittsburgh. And let's see what we've got. Yes, so that was 100 years ago. This year, 2023, is the centennial of the planetarium. And the people in Germany and around the world are very excited about this and are celebrating planetariums all through this year. The Zeiss planetariums, optomechanical, they were an imposing presence. I recognize them as kind of like a flying ant standing in the middle of the room. Stars were projected onto the dome with the light of 1,000 or 2,000 watt incandescent bulbs. Collected by 31 individual condenser lenses with metal star plates to provide pinpoint focus, and projected through 31 individual tessar enlarging lenses. And so this slide shows the Zeiss Mark I from Munich in 1925. It developed into something more recognizable in 1926. Here is the first post-war version from Zeiss, 1957. And a lot of us who've been to the McLaughlin Planetarium or one of the other large Canadian planetariums might recognize this kind of design. And the Mark VI is the type that was eventually installed in the McLaughlin Planetarium, Toronto. Okay, but first there is the Peerless Planetarium, and I want to delve back into Canadian history again. So the Peerless was designed to serve basic wartime needs. These are patents for it. Its hand crank movement and lensless pinhole star projections could simulate the rotation of the Earth, the apparent motion of the stars at different latitudes, and the positions of some solar system objects. There were 3 of them installed in Canada, and the one that was most significant to me was the one in Forest Hill Village School in Toronto, because a number of years later I actually was a student at that school, and I can't remember there being any evidence of there having been a planetarium there at all. But apparently it was set up in one of the gymnasiums in the later years of the war. All of the domes that were set up for these planetariums were 21 feet in diameter. That's probably a tooling matter. Advance the next slide. Yeah, so here's some of the literature for the Peerless Planetarium. Notice that their address was basically the Royal York Hotel. Now, these planetariums were advertised to RASC, or just demonstrated to RASC members. Here's a number of newspaper articles written by Dr. Frank Hogg in the Toronto Star, talking about plans for enlarging the role of planetariums here. RASC Toronto Centre visited the Forest Hill Planetarium on March 20th, 1945. The Hamilton Centre of the RASC visited the dome on May 6, 1948. And members of the Victoria Centre of the RASC, they were informed about the planetarium at Royal Roads at their meeting on November 8th of 1944. So here's the notice about what happened on that date in 1945 with the demonstration that they received. So if you look for From Geared to the Stars, The Evolution of Planetariums, Orreries, and Astronomical Clocks by Dr. Henry King. Henry King was later the first curator of the McLaughlin Planetarium in Toronto. A lot of us have some awareness of this book. It's a really good book about clockwork. My personal opinion is that it's more about clockwork than it is about planetariums, so caveat emptor for that. But there is a page where it describes the Peerless Planetarium with a photograph that is a little bit more detailed in some ways than anything that I've ever seen about Peerless. And there were 2 Peerless planetariums installed in the United States as well, one of them in Philadelphia, one of them in Puerto Rico. The Peerless planetariums were not heard of after 1949. The cost at the time was $4,000, and they were not competitive against newer products, such as the Spitz A1. Mr. Spitz, that's Armand Spitz, he started out as a consultant for Peerless's American distributor. But before that, he had written a book. So here's Armand Spitz, and here he is demonstrating a Model A planetarium of his some years later. All right, so in 1940, Armand Spitz had written this book, The Pinpoint Planetarium, and it was kind of a construction project. And I'm going to briefly show one thing similar to that I've got here. This is something that I built with my dad back in the late 1980s out of a book, and you can actually still find this online. It is, what's it called here? Middle on the outside or the inside? Yeah, it's called the Astrodome, from Sunstone Publications in Cooperstown. And it has little glow-in-the-dark stars on the inside. You can either poke them out, or you can watch them glow in the dark after charging them up with a flashlight. So you can either poke holes in your bores here and put them together and project them onto the wall behind you, or you could turn them the other way around, and you could have corrected images of the constellations that you could look at on an almost flat surface. And here's Dr. Chant's review of Pinpoint Planetarium from 1940 in the Journal of the RASC. Okay, so here's the Spitz Model A once more. So, and there's another one here. This is from when I started working at the Spitz Planetarium Company back in 2008. And Dr. Chant, Dr. Spitz and I are both holding his original soap flakes can planetarium. And he had done the math to predict where on a cylinder to poke holes to get representative constellation shapes. And if you look closely at that soap flakes can, you'll see that it does have holes poked in it, so that if you had a flashlight or something on the inside, you would get stars projected onto the wall behind you. And apparently one of Dr. Spitz's colleagues in New Jersey was Albert Einstein. And Einstein suggested, rather than using a cylinder, to use a dodecahedron for the Model A planetarium that he was designing. And that's a dodecahedron shape behind me there in that photo that also has pinpoints and also lenses for more magnified images of brighter stars. So Spitz completed his first production planetarium projector in 1948. It's a Platonic solid with 12 pentagonal signs. And it was mass produced so that the first magnitude stars were projected through the tiny lenses, and the rest of them were pinpoints. And Spitz Laboratories was incorporated in 1949. On November 5th of that year, Armand Spitz demonstrated the new A1 planetarium at the opening in Convocation Hall at McMaster University. And the Hamilton Center of the RASC has shown interest in the Peerless, and it was due to their president, William J. McLaughlin, that the center raised $1,000 and donated its city's first planetarium to the university. The planetarium dome at that time was a silk parachute, not an architectural structure. And for more on silk parachute type planetarium domes, we take a side trip to Halifax. The Nova Scotia Astronomical Society was founded in 1951, which became the Halifax Center of the RASC. Halifax Center's prime mover was Donald Protus, curator of Nova Scotia Museum of Science. The Provincial Museum purchased a Spitz A1 in 1955. The projection dome was constructed by museum staff, a 20-foot diameter steel skeleton with retractable flannelette surface. Halifax RASC struggled through the 1960s, and the museum was closed in 1970. At the museum's new location, the ceiling was not high enough for the planetarium dome. So the Spitz A1 was put into storage, but in the same year, the Halifax RASC came back together, and their planetarium was eventually relocated to the Dunn building at Dalhousie University, where it is still set up today. The sewing of the dome panels was done by the same Lunenburg sailmaker who made the sails for the replica of HMS Bounty, made for the 1962 film Mutiny on the Bounty. And so this one in Halifax is now the oldest operating planetarium in Canada, as far as I know. In 1958, Eisenhower, President of the United States, signed the National Defense Education Act into law. And it was a project to make sure that the next generation of educators were not all going to be drafted into industry or the military. They needed to be working in schools to teach kids about what we now think of as STEM subjects. This was important because of reactions to Sputnik and other things. And so there was a specific part of that act called the Financial Assistance for Strengthening Science, Mathematics, and Modern Foreign Language Instruction section that was really good news for planetarium manufacturers in the United States. For one thing, Zeiss was still getting back on its feet from World War II. And on the other hand, there was also Armand Spitz, who was heavily promoting his new inexpensive planetarium system. For a while, a few later on, Spitz's parent company, after Armand Spitz retired, was heavily involved in manufacturing school buildings that were very well timed for a lot of school buildings in the States that still exist today. Okay. There was a Spitz planetarium installed at the Royal Canadian Air Force Station Navigational School in PEI in the early 1950s, but I don't have much information about that. And it seems as if Canada did not react to Sputnik with an analog of the National Defense Education Act. It seems as if Canadian academics were not being drafted into industry or the military in quite the same way that they were in the United States. But there was a wave of planetarium building in Canada in the early 1960s. So we've talked about Halifax. Let's move on. Oh, forgot. Here's a page. You can see at the lower right-hand corner, this is Patrick Kelly's summary of the situation. We know Patrick. Next, here we go to Edmonton. So Edmonton City Council sought proposals in 1958 for a suitable event to add to the expected visit of Queen Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh on July 21st, 1959. The RASC Edmonton Centre proposed a planetarium, and future RASC President Franklin Lodi and Earl Milton were both young men at the time. They both endorsed the proposal, and the proposal was agreed upon March 9th, 1959. This was the same day that, same year rather, that Franklin Lodi and Earl Milton both had their 23rd birthdays. So these were young guys, very successful. So the budget for the planetarium construction was $110,000 at the time. Coronation Park is located in northwest of Edmonton in the Woodcroft neighborhood. It was the first planetarium in Canada to have its own building with the logistical problems that entailed. And that building still stands, and it has recently been redeveloped to serve as something like a planetarium. We would have found out more about that just a couple of years ago. The International Planetarium Society was going to have its international conference in Edmonton in the summer of 2020, but that ended up not happening because of COVID. The first director was Ian McLennan, who is also still with us. He was also a youthful member of the Edmonton Centre. Ian has gone on to play a global role in the construction and management of planetariums. At the opening ceremony in 1970, opening ceremony was in, I think, 1961 or 62. But at the opening ceremony, they were donated a large fragment of the Bruderheim meteorite, which had fallen outside of Edmonton on March 4th of 1960. So I got to be very grateful for people putting RASC Center newsletters online. You can really get a feel for what activities were going on. And I've relied on RASC Center archival newsletters a great deal in the production of this talk. So the dome diameter is 7.9 meters. The original projection system was a Spitz A2. You can kind of recognize that in the illustration here. But a few years later, it was replaced by a Goto, Japanese planetarium projector. This is a Venus star projector from Goto. It was replaced and installed in there in spring 1968. The Edmonton Centre had its meetings at the planetarium until February 1967, although after they relocated to another meeting space, they continued to have a relationship with the planetarium, and they came back between 1973 and 1979. This planetarium closed in 1983, shortly before the Edmonton Space Sciences Center, now known as the TELUS World of Science, opened in 1984. And I've described what has been happening in that planetarium since then. Here we go back to Toronto, and this is another deep cut. A lot of people in Toronto aren't aware that there was a planetarium at Casa Loma in 1960. The 24-foot fiberglass dome was imported by two art dealers and installed in the coach house at Casa Loma. Casa Loma was managed by the Kiwanis Club of West Toronto at the time, and the cost of the installation was $17,000. The opening was attended by Premier Robarts, Toronto Mayor Nathan Phillips, and Controller Jean Newman, who's on the right in this photo. Mrs. Newman's spouse was T. Campbell Newman, QC, who was an influential member of the RASC Toronto Centre at the time. And the lecturer was William J. McCallion. You can see him on the left. Admission was 75 cents, children 25 cents. They were open 6 days a week that summer, and we have it on record in a set of RASC National Executive Committee minutes from that year. Trying to get the RASC to help them out, but things did not really work, and the planetarium at Casa Loma closed the same year that it opened. there was a set of minutes from November 14th, 1960 that shows that further action to help them out was withheld, and it was agreed to let the Toronto Centre know, but it's not known what happened to the Spitz hardware. So that was an experiment that didn't succeed, but behind the scenes, things were starting to happen at the Royal Ontario Museum. So back in Calgary, they had inaugurated their own RASC Center in 1958 by a fellow named Link, who was a petrogeologist, who was very successful, actually has a rock sitting on the surface of Mars now named after him. Members of the RASC Center in Calgary participated in a Calgary Herald contest in 1963 to determine the best idea for a city project to mark Canada's upcoming Centennial. And Centennial project planetariums are going to become a bit of a theme coming up. They won first prize with their proposal, and they eventually went through with an architectural study with a detailed proposal, and the architects were MacMillan, Long and Associates. You'll see there's a difference there between the left and the right sides. The original proposal included a 24-meter tall tower with an observing platform at the top that was going to be shielded from city lights. But they decided, no, we don't actually really want that because it'll be too shaky. And this is another thing that I've noticed during my career working in planetariums, is periodically some architectural choices will work their way into the final design of a planetarium that shouldn't really be there, like windows to the exterior inside the planetarium dome. We've seen that a couple of times. We generally paint them over with black, and they're not really a problem. So instead of that 24-meter tall tower, there's a 10-meter tall tower that you can see on the edge of the planetarium building there, I think. It was shielded so that light pollution from lights below wouldn't come up into the observing space. Their projection system was a Zeiss Universal projection planetarium from the East German Zeiss operation at the time. So Zeiss actually, after World War II, Jena found itself in the Russian zone, Germany, now that for years after was known as East Germany. But a lot of Zeiss expertise also found its way into the American zone, Germany, to a city called Oberkochen. And Oberkochen and Zeiss had parallel production lines. One of the important things was that because of Cold War embargoes, Zeiss planetariums from Jena, from East Germany, could not be imported into the United States, but those from Oberkochen in West Germany could. My understanding is that Canada did not have an embargo on Zeiss at the time, or Jena in particular, or I mean East Germany in general. So the projection system for the Calgary Planetarium coming from East Germany was not a problem at the time. They'd recovered from their post-war disruption. They also had several Zeiss telescopes set up inside the observing deck. They had a 19.8 meter diameter dome with 254 seats. The cost was $1,224,000. And the first director of the planetarium was Sig Weiser, who was an immigrant from Austria. Okay, now to Montreal. July 1964, Dow Brewery announced that it was financing the construction of a planetarium at Chaboyer Square. The planetarium was announced after Calgary's one, but it was completed first on April 1st, 1966. They were on the cover of Sky and Telescope, as you can see. Montreal had been preparing to host Expo 67, and so this was working to a deadline. The Dow building was designed with a 1,700 meter square footprint, and it received steam heating from the brewery across the street. Okay. So back at the Royal Ontario Museum was this guy, Dr. Victor Ben Meen. He was a geologist and gemologist. Oh, wait a minute, I'm using the wrong photo. I'm sorry. Victor Meen was a real-life Indiana Jones. And here's a photo of him from the National Geographic magazine in 1951, when he was exploring what was then known as Chubb Crater in northern Quebec. So he was responsible for the first exploration of that impact crater. In the mid-1960s, he visited Iran extensively in the preparation of a book called Crown Jewels of Iran, which was a colorful study of one of the world's greatest national treasures. He also did extensive gemological studies in Burma before the country was closed. Before the Iranian expedition, Dr. Meen had made himself an expert on planetariums as well. He claimed to have visited and inspected virtually every major planetarium on Earth. The RASC Toronto Centre had a planetarium committee, and he was on it. Dr. Meen also would have known Carl Reinhardt, who was an elderly member of the Toronto Centre. He lived upstairs from the RASC offices at 252 College Street. And when he passed away, Reinhardt made bequests to McGill, Queen's, University, and the RASC in the fields of both mining geology and astronomy. In particular, he donated $10,000 to the RASC for a planetarium fund, provided it be initiated within 10 years. So that's like small amount comparative to the cost of an architectural planetarium, but there you go. There was a Goto Planetarium demonstration sponsored by the Japan Trade Center at the CNE in 1964. David Dunlap Observatory Director Donald McRae visited there, and he was quoted in the newspaper after visiting that they were looking into this, and they were looking for $1 million to donate to the establishment of a permanent planetarium at the Royal Ontario Museum. There was previously a Metro Toronto proposal to build a planetarium as a Centennial project in St. Lawrence Market, but it went nowhere. So then Colonel McLaughlin comes into the picture. He was the founder of General Motors of Canada. And while Victor Meen was away in Tehran in October 1964, someone named Mr. English arrived unexpectedly at the ROM to speak with Director Swinton. Mr. English was the secretary of Mr. McLaughlin. Mr. McLaughlin orbited in Canada's highest social circles. He remembered visiting the Hayden Planetarium in New York City, which was named after a banker and philanthropist friend of his. Colonel McLaughlin had also socialized with Mrs. Dunlap, and the 93-year-old Colonel McLaughlin presented a check for $1 million according to initial reports, although the eventual estimate for the cost of the McLaughlin Planetarium was over $2 million. The difference didn't matter to Colonel McLaughlin, who said, make it the best. During construction of the planetarium, the RASC, the ROM director Swinton retired, and he was replaced by Peter Swan, who was formerly curator of Oxford University's Museum of Eastern Art. Swan's tenure at the ROM was marked by the museum becoming independent from University of Toronto and acquiring a provincially appointed board of trustees, increased operating funds from the provincial government, priorities for repairs, increased membership and fundraising, and a general change in the attitude of the galleries. All right, so here's the architectural plan for the planetarium. Originally, the area where the word planetarium appears next to the planetarium was the entrance to a courtyard. But plans were to eventually build that out, and that's what was done. If you go to that area now, this is something close to how it appears today, although I believe the courtyard in the middle there has also been filled in. This is a really interesting architectural drawing that is located at the RASC's national office. If you've been there, you might recognize that hardwood table that it's sitting on. So the design that they chose for the planetarium was consciously echoed by a building called the Cenotaph for Newton, which was actually not built, but it was designed in the 18th century by a French architect. And it was kind of comparable to the David Dunlap Observatory architecture as well. I think my next shot here, yes, here we go. The DDO's telescope dome hemisphere sits on top of a cylinder that is equal to 1/2 of the height of a spheroid of the same dimensions. And McLaughlin is kind of the same. If you were to invert the hemisphere underneath the upper hemisphere, you would have spheroid. The dome was 26 meters tall. It was higher than other single-story planetariums. It actually is. There's at least 2 stories in there with no elevator. And there we go. You might recognize standing in the corner as a young Terence Dickinson. This was Terence Dickinson's first job in the astronomical field. Here he is photobombing the planetarium. So the inaugural curator of McLaughlin was Dr. King, as I mentioned before. He was headhunted from the London Planetarium in England. And so he was hired by the end of 1966. Construction continued through 1967. And the opening ceremony was on October 26, 1968. Premier Robarts and the former Dominion astronomer Carlisle Beals attended. Dr. Norman Green, who was a past president of the RASC Hamilton Center, he was the national secretary of the RASC at the time, and Dr. Thomas Clark were both hired as assistant curators. And Terence Dickinson was hired as a curatorial assistant. And Dr. King reinforced his relationship with the community by proposing to let the RASC Toronto Center meet in the 150-seat basement auditorium, and he allocated space there for the Toronto Center's optical workshop. And so that is what happened in time for the 100th anniversary of the original meeting of the Toronto Astronomical Club, which was on December 1st of 1968. That was another precursor to the RASC. Moving ahead. Oh, wait a minute. So this is an interesting kind of soapy story. The planetarium projector for McLaughlin was from East Germany. And I guess when you're an East German engineer living it up in Toronto in 1968, and you're about to have to go home to East Germany, you might get into trouble with the law. And that's exactly what happened here. Maybe less said about this one, the better. Here we are in the Lockhart Planetarium in Winnipeg. The Lockhart Planetarium was opened at University of Manitoba in 1965. Visit of K.O. Wright, who was the assistant director of Dominion Astrophysical Observatory, and he was the national president of the RASC at the time. It was a new university building with the planetarium taking up one room. And they got a Spitz A3P projector. You can see the bottom half of the projector with the planet carousel there. Capacity was for 70 people. And it had a spherical star ball rather than the dodecahedron one. We'll see a few more of those coming on. Down the street, here is the Manitoba Museum. This was a Centennial project. It was part of an urban renewal project where there were some, I think we would think of them as slums in this part of Winnipeg that were torn down so they built the Manitoba Museum of Man and Nature and the Planetarium, the Manitoba Theatre Centre, and the Centennial Concert Hall. The neighborhood is called South Point Douglas, which has historically had the lowest average family income of any electoral division in Manitoba, with a high proportion of rental accommodations and ethnic diversity. It was funded through the generosity of the Saidi and Samuel Bronfman Foundation. The chair of the Centennial Corporation was Maitland Steinkopf, who was a provincial cabinet minister. Dennis Gallagher was appointed the planetarium director. The planetarium had 287 seats. They received a Zeiss Mark V from Oberkochen in West Germany. And their opening was attended by the Lieutenant Governor Richard Bowles. That was on May 15th, 1968. And you can't quite see it here. I think you might be able to see something just between, just above and to the left of the Manitoba in Manitoba Museum. there's a coelostat sticking out of the second floor of that office building. That's actually a part of a stationary solar telescope. The coelostat is designed to reflect sunlight through an aperture in the floor and the vapor barrier of the plaza in front of the planetarium into a subterranean solar telescope. And that was installed for the 500th anniversary of the birth of Copernicus in 1973. It seems as appropriate as a Copernicus memorial. And it was attended by the visit of Dr. Wilhelmina Iwanowska, who was a Polish astronomer. She was traveling across Canada in January 1973 and made lots of visits across the country. And later, I believe she became an RASC honorary member. Okay, this is the MacMillan Planetarium, or the MacMillan Space Center in Vancouver. It was built by the city of Vancouver with a gift of $1.5 million from H.R. MacMillan, that's as in MacMillan Bloedel, forestry conglomerate. Planetarium was located in Vanier Park on English Bay, close to the Vancouver Maritime Museum. And it was co-located with the Centennial Museum of Vancouver. And it was opened on May 30th, 1967, or rather, Vanier Park was opened on May 30th, 1967. And their opening was later in 1968, I think just shortly before McLaughlin and Toronto opened. They had a Zeiss Mark IV projector from Jena, 232 seats. They were opened on October 28th of 1968. And they included the first planetarium automation system in Canada in 1969. Automation of planetariums is a very important subject. Just like, computerized telescopes, you can have a Dobsonian or a manual telescope and you can do a good deal with it. But if you want to have things run on a sort of a complex program, it's really useful. I skip ahead just a little bit. Yes. So at the time, of course, there weren't really computerized projection systems. They were slides, were essential for optomechanical planetariums in order to display images on parts of the dome. The MacMillan had this system installed in 1969. It was called Instant Dimmer Memory, manufactured by Strand Electric, which was a company from the UK. By automation, slides and special effects in the dome could be automatically triggered by a magnetic drum, instead of having to have a planetarium operator using a script and pressing buttons manually. Later systems included the cues to automatically advance slides on the audio tape that carried pre-recorded narrations, until computerized systems were developed that could automate an entire planetarium show, including the star projector. But they also got scooped just a little bit down the street, or rather in another part of the greater Vancouver area, is the British Columbia Institute of Technology. They acquired a Spitz A3P projector and a 9.1 meter dome for Burnaby in September 1967. Unlike the big planetarium down on the coast, the one at BCIT cost $50,000. It did not require an elaborate enclosure like the Zeiss planetariums, just a large room for the building, for the dome to be constructed inside. Also, in 1967, Laurentian University in Sudbury acquired an A3P and a 9.1 meter dome, largely due to the efforts of Reverend Roger Leclerc, who was a Jesuit. The A3P was used in a portable classroom until 1970 when it was permanently installed in the new science building. Funds were bequeathed by William J. Doran of Sudbury for the planetarium. The Sudbury Astronomy Club, which lately became a new center of the RASC just a few years ago, has typically had their meetings there. And one of the latest things that I noticed just earlier today, in fact, I saw an interview with the new director of the Doran Planetarium. And you might have heard of Laurentian University recently. It is insolvent. I hope that their planetarium is making money. They are still using the same planetarium projector that was installed in 1967. So if they can do something with that, that's great. These documents are from the vertical files down in Spitz. they quite kindly let me take some photos of these. The one on the right is a letter from Dr. Lavoie to Terence Dickinson of McLaughlin, and I imagine that letter on the right is one from the RASC archives, which we received after the McLaughlin closed. So next is the plan to build a planetarium at the Ontario Centennial Science Center. That's what they called it at the time. And this is another Spitz document, but the documentation shows that this Spitz A3P projector was ordered for this new planetarium that they were building. And it was never installed. It basically just sat there. Donald Crotus from Nova Scotia, you'll remember from earlier, he was part of the executive team that ordered this system and oversaw the Science Center establishment. But they ended up not using it. In fact, the original space that I think they were planning to use the planetarium for turned out not to be available and was the wrong size. They actually returned the dome structure to Spitz and had us replace that with something of a different diameter. And that is still the projection surface that they're using at the planetarium now. It's probably the first tilted planetarium dome in Canada. And as to what happened to their A3P projector, well, they're not using that anymore. We'll get back to that in a few minutes. Okay, Hamilton. Now this is a planetarium that you have never seen before because it doesn't exist. A company called Salata Foods that I know that still sells tea. I suppose they're probably not the same as they used to be. There was a planetarium to build, there was a project to build $1 million planetarium in Hamilton as part of another kind of urban renewal project. But it ended up not happening because there was a corporate change of ownership at Salata and ended up not happening. So other things that were connected with Spitz. Here's a photo of me with a Spitz Junior planetarium. I think you might still be able to get these secondhand. I'm not sure if they're still being made. I actually have one right here. The one in the photo belonged to the RASC Toronto Center. This one here used to belong to Jeff Garrity. And on the right is a more technological planetarium built by Harmonic Reed, which I think they either had some employees that were former Spitz employees, or they had licensed the Spitz name, certainly for the Spitz Junior. They had a relationship at arm's length from the Spitz company. Eventually, when Harmonic Reed went away, their tooling and their catalog was taken up by Spitz itself. And so at Spitz, we continued to service these. I think that's a Nova 3 planetarium on the right. And that's there is Sue Gordon, who's my manager. That planetarium was at Mount Cuba Observatory, which is in Delaware. Now we go to Cod College in St. John's, Newfoundland. This article by Gary Diamond is about the Harmonic Reed Planetarium that was installed in the Marine Institute Planetarium in St. John's. College of Fisheries, Navigation, Marine Engineering, and Electronics. They acquired a Nova 3 in 1966 for about $2,000. They moved it in 1985 to a new address and renamed it. And the planetarium was replaced by a Spitz 373, which was kind of similar to the Nova 3, but it was the Spitz improvement upon the Harmonic Reed design. It was replaced at that point for $26,000 US. And the 4.3 diameter dome was replaced with a 5.5 meter dome. They became associated with Memorial University of Newfoundland in 1992. And their planetarium is now regularly operated by members of the RASC St. John's Center on schedule and by appointment. On Cape Breton Island, Canada Coast Guard College acquired a Nova 3 in 1968 with a 4.6 meter dome for 30 seats for about $8,800. According to Raymond Auclair, who was a prominent national member of the RASC, at some point during holidays in the early 1970s, the college had a fire, which destroyed the history of the planetarium to that point, but the operation was not affected by the fire. And they hosted the RASC General Assembly in 1989, but the planetarium wasn't used on that occasion. In 1975, government of Alberta consulted with Queen Elizabeth Planetarium in Edmonton to plans to set up a mobile planetarium program to reach schools in remote communities. And that's what this correspondence here is about. Letters from the Provincial Museum of Alberta. And so rather than reusing the old Spitz A2 from Edmonton, they acquired a Spitz 373 and a fiberglass dome for about 19,000 US dollars. And they got a second system in 1981 for $11,000 and a third one in 1986 for $20,000. And this is a photo that, a couple of photos that shows them packing up their mobile planetarium to carry it around. This is not an inflatable planetarium dome. This is something that they had to actually hump all over the place to get it to use in different communities. And here's a flyer from them, from the government of Alberta, because of course, when you have a planetarium and you're using it to deal with on-topic educational subjects, you have to have a program to appeal to teachers and parents, students, to deal with certain things that they are required to learn. Here we are in Seneca College in Toronto. The gentleman with the sidebars is a young Bill Moselle. He's using their Spitz A3P. And in the lower left-hand corner, that's a photo of Roberta Bondar in the planetarium later in the 1980s. They actually ended up naming this planetarium after Roberta Bondar, but it no longer exists. So this planetarium was added in 1973. The original teaching master of the planetarium was Harlan Crichton, who was the president of RASC Toronto Centre at the time. So now we go to Collingwood, and I don't have a planetarium photo from Collingwood, unfortunately. But here we are in Blue Mountain Lodge in Collingwood. Founder of this ski resort was a Slovakian immigrant named Jozo Vider. And he had eclectic tastes. He'd earlier branched out successfully by creating the popular Blue Mountain pottery, which some of you might have decorating your homes. I certainly hope so. Vider set aside some land across from the pottery factory and one unit of the little shopping center he built to put in a planetarium. And he purchased a Zeiss ZKP, that's Zeiss Klein Planetarium, star projector from East Germany around 1970 during a visit to Europe. He installed it with a 6-meter dome in 1971, and efforts were made to produce a well-animated program, but it wasn't successful. And he passed away in autumn 1971, and they shelved future plans for that planetarium. So then, that planetarium projector from Zeiss was acquired in 1977 by the Science Centre in Toronto, their head of astronomy, Claude Faubert, and they installed it in Don Mills. So what happened to the planetarium projector that they had at the Science Centre? Well, Peter, just briefly, what happened to that A3P?
Well, Eric, you're putting me on the spot, but I can tell you that in the summer of 1980, the London Regional Children's Museum, through means that were not known to me, talked to the Ontario Science Centre and arranged to borrow the A3P. And I remember going to Toronto in a cube van with one of the other full-time employees at the Children's Museum to pick it up. We packed it up in the back of the van, took it back to London, and it basically sat in the Children's Museum for many years. I didn't know squat. I still don't know squat about electronics, and it had a lot of electromechanical stuff that totally was baffling to me. And it never really worked, as far as I know. I can talk a lot more about what the Children's Museum did instead, but as far as I know, the Children's Museum, I worked there as a summer student in the summer of 1980, and that's when all this happened. But I did keep in touch with the place, and at least probably 15 years later, it was still sitting there. And I think it eventually went back to McMaster University. Sorry, I shouldn't say back because that's not where it came from.
That's right,
and I
but it
think
did end
it's
up
there
at
now.
McMaster University at the McLaughlin Planetarium for several years, and someone from Spitz came out and did the twiddling of knobs and the running of cables to make it work. And I'm not sure at what point that started, but I know that it ended sometime early in, let me think, was it as late as 2009? In any case, Doug Welch from McMaster University oversaw the conversion from that A3P to a more modern digital projector, which I visited subsequently. So the Zeiss ZKP3, which you can see here with Brenda standing beside it, is now mounted out in the gallery of the planetarium at the Science Center. After it was used for many years, I spoke with Bob McDonald from the CBC. His first job was as the first operator of the planetarium at the Science Center. And there were some interesting technical things with that system at the time. Just getting towards the end here, University of Prince Edward Island, they had a planetarium as Spitz A3P installed in 1980 with their first show on July 1st, 1981. It was constructed as an 18-meter geodesic outbuilding containing a 9-meter diameter projection dome, about 60 unidirectional seats. They were later damaged and dismantled, although it was later re-erected at the now defunct Great Science and Adventure Park in Stanley Bridge, Prince Edward Island, which is one of those famous PEI tourist traps. I have just one more planetarium to talk about. This is a Goto planetarium that was installed at a high school in Niagara Falls. Niagara College of Applied Arts and Technology in Welland acquired a Vulex Apollo planetarium manufactured by Goto in 1977. By 1984, the college had transferred the planetarium to Stanford Collegiate and Vocational Institute, Niagara Falls. The projector is currently in private hands of a member of the RASC Niagara Center. And that's about it for history of planetariums. I have a few slides after this to talk about things that I've been doing much more recently in the planetarium field. And I also have a link that I'm going to post in the chat of a longer video about our newest projects at Spitz that you might want to check out at your convenience. Let's see the chat window. Chat. Here we are. There you go. So check that out when it's convenient. How are we for time? That's about all that I have to say about the history of planetariums, but I could say a few more words about its future.
Like I said, I'm good. I'm in Central Time, so it's early here. It's up to you.
Where are you, Rick?
Regina.
Oh, okay. All right, I'm going to advance through the rest of my slides. Okay, so put that away. These photos were taken at Spitz Institute, which is an event for educators that we have in Chatsford, Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia every summer. And it's a well-attended event. Actually, my first week at work when I was working for Spitz in 2008 was one of these institute weeks. It was sort of a baptism by fire. And at first, when I was working with Spitz, we were working with the Sidome, which uses Starry Night, which I hope that a lot of you guys are familiar with. Starry Night, the Canadian Astronomy Planetarium program. So Starry Night was licensed to us at Spitz to use in our Sidomes. And there are currently a few Sidomes operating in Canada. There is the one at the Lockhart Planetarium in Winnipeg, which we looked at earlier. And there was a Sidome until recently installed in Watson Lake in the Yukon Territory. I have more to talk about with Watson Lake in part 2 of this talk. But there are more than 100 Sidomes operating across the United States. Now, if you've been using Starry Night more recently, you'll have noticed that the Starry Night people now are responsible for Sky Safari, which you can use on your cell phone, And no new versions of Starry Night have come out for some time. And I'm not sure what's going on with the future of Starry Night, but it has a lot of name recognition and a lot of love from me and from other people. But we now no longer license Sidome and Starry Night at Spitz. We are now using what's called Digistar. Let's see here. Resume slideshow. Okay, so this is a Digistar planetarium. It happens to be in Thailand. Digistar is capable of projecting onto much larger dome surfaces, and they use a product from Spitz's parent company, Evans and Sutherland. And whereas Spitz is located in Chatsworth, Pennsylvania, Evans and Sutherland is located in Salt Lake City, Utah. And I have more to talk about the relationship between Spitz and Evans and Sutherland in part 2 of this talk. But here's our most interesting new product. Now, this is not a projection dome. If you click on that video link, you will be watching an interview about Domex, which is our LED paneled dome product. And this is the entertainment center at Salt Lake City at our offices there. And it's huge. And its resolution is very high. It's a very immersive experience. It requires a massive number of graphics processors on computers. And I mean, a picture tells 1,000 words. It has 2 stories above it for looking into it. COSM is now the parent company of Evans and Sutherland and Spitz. And COSM is taking the planetarium field and combining it with the sports entertainment field. And we are currently building 2 real entertainment centers for partners. One of them is located next to the NFL stadium in Los Angeles. And the other one is being built in suburban Dallas. These are massive. And I would really love for a gigantic sports entertainment complex stroke planetarium to be built in the Toronto area as well. Just for comparison, this is the Experience Center, or rather a model of it that I 3D printed. And I've put it next to an image of the James Webb Space Telescope's mirror to give you a sense of proportion for it. Here I am standing in the entertainment center in Salt Lake City, pretending to be standing in Venice. And I was able to fool various friends of mine into thinking that I'd gone somewhere where I hadn't gone. And that is the end of my planetariums talk. Thank you.